from the lucid fringe. Ravings from the lucid fringe. Musings from an unpasteurized life. Improvised on the front line of love and beauty. Welcome, I'm Semeric Yarrow. This week on Ravings from the Lucid Fringe, episode 50. Summer Hail and Swallows. An Expedition to Atlantica, Part 1. Madrid in June. This is the first installment of a ship's log sharing the veritable impressions of a visitor from the African Antipodes returning to the strange and mythical lands at the west of Europe to gawp at the natives. Or something like that, my China. The many translucent colours of the airport panels are the first clue. By the time I'm in the city, there's a spiritedness and bustle which I'm used to from my tropical travels, and which I welcome as a richer sign of my arrival in Spain. I briefly consider whether I'm the last remaining person born in the British Isles to set foot in this apparently over-visited country, even among those of us permanently based in the Southern Hemisphere. But still, I'm excited for the beginning of my expedition. To be fair, I did enter Spain once before, for about 2 hours, when I was 14, hiking in the French Pyrenees, and the path briefly crossed the border. I recall actually a sense of freedom and elation up there, leaping probably dangerously over crevices for a while until my family called me back. My father's first vista of that area was 3 decades earlier, looking through La Brèche de Roland, where that old bugger Charlemagne's senior seigneur, Roland, supposedly sliced a chunk through the great natural wall of Gavarnie in his quest to keep the Moors in Iberia and out of France. It's got to be one of the most impressive unmanned border posts around. In contrast to my 1980s recollections in the early years of Spain's reborn democracy, he recalls suddenly seeing a harsh 1950s landscape after the green French slopes, which resonated with him as a metaphor for the fascist Franco regime that ruled then. And yes, numerous Spaniards I speak with confirm, deforestation was kind of a feature under the dictatorship. To say Spain often presents us with two sides is almost certainly a cliché, as perhaps will be everything that I talk about on this trip, as an exotic adventurer into the most tourist-heavy countries on Earth. Spain and France hold the global top spots for numbers of annual foreign visitors, as well as to the most written about places in the English language. Britain's navel-gazing of itself is legendary, among English writers particularly. Throw in a couple of other countries, Ireland, formerly part of that empire, and Portugal, which began the whole imperial Atlantic story, and you have a large region that I'm calling Atlantica. A region slightly larger than my home, South Africa, with a substantially bigger population and containing 4 former empires that caused all the cuck, yawn, etc., etc. Imagine, if you will, that it was one country, a series of peninsulas and an archipelago with many distinctions but also common threads. This is a place I'm on an expedition to, a pilgrimage of sorts, and I'm starting in the southern bit, Iberia, far away from my traditional culturally Anglo comfort zone, and far closer in many ways to the last colourful place I took time out to visit, Mexico, which is, by the way, twice the size of all these places put together. So, what does Madrid have to tell me about all this? Again, I'm acutely aware in this speed scroll voyage that there's great holes I will miss along the way. I'm more aiming at impressionism than the steady patience of, say, a Velázquez, whose Las Meninas will startle me with its disarming intensity on an evening transiting the Prado. I hear of great multicultural markets that spill across suburbs, but they happen on days I'm not actually going to be here. In the barrio of letters, which, as a theatre and literary man, I'm probably most immediately attracted to, the statue of Lorca, Spain's great and passionate 20th century poet and playwright, is represented instead by a traffic cone when I visit, under reconstruction, as all great cities always are. That explosive human desire for creative change again. The last major European city I visited was Istanbul. Indeed, this very morning I was there again, and hopped across the Bosporus on a bus via a vertigo-inducing road bridge and visited Asia for the first time in decades. I found a bustling suburb, less touristy than the Golden Horn side of things, more Seapoint style. Men and women out in their jogging shorts, playing tennis, with a big advert for the national women's volleyball team. Turkish citizens of Istanbul quietly getting on with things in a recognisably liberal way, including chic shops selling local plonk, even if their strongman president had put their mayor in prison where he remains at the time of speaking. But quietly, on the metro, for example, was the operative word. For centuries, Istanbul faced off against Madrid at opposite ends of the Mediterranean, and now I've come to see the other, rather louder side of things. Except that with that Atlantic explorer edge, Madrid is, not surprisingly, very diverse these days. The designated capital of a massive European ex-empire, exporting its language and now receiving back the descendants of those forced to learn it. This is still the obvious European Mecca for the Hispanic world. Madrid became the new capital of Spain around the time that Mexico City became the capital of New Spain, so the parallels are easy to spot, as well, of course, as the Mexicans themselves. I buy authentic tacos from some one night, very different to the Tex-Mex stuff in Anglophone lands. I buy some Navarran sheep cheese from a black Colombian cheesemonger. I take a city tour in Spanish. The other tourists I'm with are Argentinian. The owner of the apartment I'm staying in is a grandmother from the Dominican Republic. Her daughter is currently holidaying there, enjoying what looks like Caribbean sun and surf somewhere where Spanish is probably being heard a lot more at this time of year, in June, than, say, Benidorm. I think the Spanish places I heard about when I was growing up were mostly the equivalent of down-market Blackpool or Great Yarmouth, but with better weather. Cheap resort towns with dodgy concrete hotels filled with that other kind of creature, Brits seeking alcohol. Torremolinos, Marbella, Lanzarote. Even Malaga, which I had no idea was Picasso's hometown, was tarred with a culture-free brush in my British TV-attuned childish mind. So there's obviously much more to discover about the Spanish coast than hangover-curing British breakfast joints. But in general, I'm looking in this country for the authentic roots, and the opportunity to speak much more Spanish over the next couple of weeks. Of course, this may well show how much I have in common with an elderly, skinny knight I see on statues and other images all over the place. I might just be tilting at windmills like Don Quixote. The quest for authentic hidden spots away from the tidal torrent of tourism is perhaps a bird that has flown. ChatGPT will tell me about 50 of these, no doubt, if I ask it, as will regular Google via a plethora of 10 secret spots blogs. But I'll try find some anyway, and away from Barcelona too, which was experiencing major protests when I arrived in the country against the constant influx of non-locals with selfie disease. Actually, that sheep cheese is my first taste of the regional culinary varieties Spain as a whole prides itself on, rather like the proud specialities in different states of Mexico I visited. However, Spanish food is rather different, and perhaps because of the regional pride it's not much known about as a whole, certainly not in South Africa, for example, though on this journey I will see lots of places outside of Spain claiming to offer tapas, like Breton tapas in the north of France. Maybe there's not much hot spice, but there's definitely variety. And here in Madrid, in the heart of the country and very far from the long coastline, I'm already getting a sense that fish and other frutas del mar are super important. There's another thing I heard about Spain when I was growing up, that Spanish fishing fleets were a new armada, overfishing in North Atlantic waters and in fact anywhere else they could get to round the globe, and clearly it was to satisfy their rich and tasty and probably very healthy traditional diet of things from the sea. I will definitely indulge in seafood on my trip, but I do have to wonder whether the Spanish could consider eating a little less of it, perhaps. Still, tapas is a great example of the difference between Spanish bar culture and the aforementioned Brits seeking alcohol culture. Sure, you might buy some chips or peanuts to accompany your pint of craft beer in northern climes, but the beer's the main event. Here, my new friends show me you can buy beer in inexpensive little cañas, small glasses that are there to whet your appetite for the specialty food you came for, before sauntering basically sober to the next establishment. These days, in both countries, you can also often get 0% versions of beer, including tostada, the maltier type I'm fond of, which helps even more. The streets are buzzing of an evening, and for a South African these June evenings in Western Europe are wildly long. Our summer sunsets don't get much past 8 p.m. even in December. I make my way through the alleys of La Latina, passing a theatre that's recently been showing a Fugard piece in translation. Theatre is both a great barometer for getting to grips with local life and rather difficult if it is wordy and in another tongue. Instead of watching New Bethesda characters speaking Espanol, I choose a comedy that's getting good reviews, featuring 4 women climbing a Patagonian mountain, speaking rapidly with lots of jerga, slang, thrown in, much of which I look up afterwards to improve my impolite Spanish vocab and redden my cheeks. The acting is vivacious, even if the subject matter's fairly frothy. The auditorium is packed, for the arts are generally well supported here. Impressed, I step out into the late daylight of this evening in Malasaña. Ah, Malasaña. Another suburb with a relentless creative energy, if somewhat distinct because of its fame as the heart of the anarchic 1980s movida. Though that wasn't by any means the first time Spain's anarchist, freedom-loving spirit had emerged from an onslaught of rigidity. On my first night in the capital, I had ducked into the Reina Sofia Modern Art Museum, partly because it's free in the evenings and partly because there was an unexpected warm summer hailstorm hitting the streets outside. There I found, of course, Dali being stylishly crude, and Picasso's massive Guernica. But there's also a range of lesser-known responses to the terror from the skies, aerial bombardment being tested out in the Civil War with horrifying impacts on civilians for the first time. The artists who could see clearly had to respond, and so art, beauty, and politics mingle on the contested stage. My attention was also taken to the lower floors, where there was a Guerrilla Girls exhibition, brash, brilliant, funny, feminist, and as anonymous as medieval old masters, though for somewhat different reasons. Their Madrid counterparts are there as a contrast, for the localized post-Franco swing towards sex, drugs, rock and roll, and progressive identity politics had a lot going for it. There might not be spice in the food, but perhaps that's because there's already enough spice to go round in Madrid. I would see more of the movida in a Malasaña bar-cum-museum, featuring memorabilia from the Madrid answers to punk and new wave and synth pop, all happening at once as freedom exploded. These days, perhaps it's a meta-memory rather than such an ongoing creative wave. It reminds me of the explosive, creative, musical freedom of Cape Town when I arrived in the 90s at the end of apartheid. Or perhaps they're both an echo of the infamous revolutionary artistic freedom of those early pre-Stalin years in the young Soviet Union. There are other important things I note in the radical parts of the gallery. A series of beautiful, painted, politically charged, dug-out canoes made by Zapatista artists from Chiapas. It seems even my first port of call in rural Mexico has long threads with Madrid. And elsewhere in left thinking, Russian pieces on display comment on the kind of sacred indigenous communism the Zapatistas represented in the 90s. Another Latino artist has painted images of Apollo space modules as organic forest machines. The creative fruit of opposing forces on display once more. Much closer to home, there's an exhibit of artwork produced for literacy programs in newly independent Mozambique, freed like Madrid in the mid-70s when the Iberian dictator couple, Franco and Portugal's Salazar, were both finally defeated by death. Of course, Mozambique was instantly sucked into a Cold War apartheid-era proxy war, but for a while there was something else aimed at. Even in the darker times, it's human creative sparks that help us vision something else. Here, too, there's an exhibit exploring Expo 92 in Seville, which I remember hearing about. It seems to have been a curiously half-baked attempt to acknowledge the cultural riches of the broader Spanish-speaking world in particular, without saying sorry for the damage along the way. If Mussolini's fascist Italy had as its defining myth the recreation of empire inspired by ancient Rome and its symbolic senatorial fasces, Franco had a much more recent empire he tried to conjure up pride in, and that hadn't really faded as an idea by 1992. Franco kept close to him members of the former royal family, those whose real recent ancestors had ruled it all, and some of whom have subsequently got their titles back and their residences. However, unlike Mussolini's much mocked attempts to make a new empire, Franco's Spain was famously inward-looking. Perhaps Madrid still has so many charming neighbourhoods of small streets because the regime didn't have the cash to go around clearing and modernising much. Franco's forces in the Civil War set themselves up in the Casa de Campo, the former royal hunting grounds at the foot of the central palace, from where they shelled the plebs relentlessly. It's peaceful now, and I head out for a visit on a hot afternoon. The municipal swimming pool is pretty full when I head in for a dip, and presumably the fascists would be horrified to see the amount of nonchalant toplessness here in the heart of the Spanish capital on a summer's day. I am grateful for the cool water, one alternative for this time of day. Another would be passing out somewhere for siesta time. Apparently it's no longer a thing, but it seems a pretty obvious way to build stamina for the long evening ahead. Another day I spend the hottest hours in a massive bookshop on the Gran Via, the one great concession in Madrid to shopping boulevard culture, where I while away my air-conditioned time being overwhelmed at the amount of Spanish-language literature on display that I've never heard of. Then there are dozens of racks featuring books about the history of Spain and more about other Spanish-speaking regions and territories. Perhaps some of them end up translated and on display in exclusive books or Waterstones, but probably just the ones that win prizes. One new friend here is named after Madrid's great novelist of the early 20th century, Pío Baroja y Nesi, who apparently captured the essence of the streets in far more detail than this. That full surname, by the way, Baroja y Nesi, is the typical Spanish format: two surnames, one taken from each of his parents' two surnames. Spanish linguists might be wrestling with arguments over masculine pronouns, but their flexible surname rules seem way ahead of their time. Both Picasso and Lorca are known by their mothers' surnames. I buy a book by a millennial writer, pretty tapped into the liberal energy of the city, set mostly in Malasaña, it seems. Busy and frank and funny and just a little bit sexy, and painting scenes that are fresh to me, even if they might seem stock images if I'd been here longer. I climb up a hill on the west side of the city to the ancient Egyptian temple of Debod, this one not stolen by colonial pirates but actually given willingly as a bizarre gift. Egypt's nationalist president Nasser had used Spanish fascist know-how for dam construction and gave this to Franco as a gift. Modern dictators seem quite often to relish big construction project statements, and dams were one of Franco's favourites. I will soon see one of his when looking out from Castellera de la Frontera in the Spanish southwest. In the muggy heat of the late afternoon I find a cool shelter and a tortilla in a classic old restaurant down below the hillside, once frequented by my partner who studied ceramics nearby. She makes pretty mean tortillas herself. It's my main reference point for Spanish food, actually. Another South African friend who had lived in Spain for years made it for me in Cape Town 30 years ago. Eggs with chunks of potato as well as other flavours makes for a wonderful kitchen comfort food. The restaurant's pretty empty because I'm too early for the night and too late for lunch. Although my body clock is adjusting rapidly here, I never quite eat as late as many Spaniards, even if it's far more fun to be out when the crowds are too. The next morning I do manage one proper occasion of eating out at the right time, trying delicious thick hot chocolate with churros. They're all over Mexico, where chocolate obviously originates, and they're all over Madrid too. I don't know who claims to have invented these deep-fried squirts, but I imagine rival origin stories. Shops, I think, are closed for the day, suddenly burst into life after 10 a.m, and all the while there's balconies and flowers above, for the heart of the city is also usually full of communal living still. Sometimes it can get a bit intense, so the Parque del Retiro to the east was always where the gentry would retreat in times past, and where I head to. Except that along the way I find more Mexican-style familiarity, a great Latin American procession, thrilling in colour and brass and dance and excitement. If we were in a more staid northerly land, this would be a stark contrast to the surroundings. But the colours of Spain and the Hispanic world have been splashing into each other for centuries. I enter the tree-lined paths of the Retiro, stepping back into a little Art Deco elegance, and to where the citizens find their green breaths. But there are other layers here to notice, which I also see at the Museum of Madrid, or hear about on the city tour I take. Royalty, aristocracy, the combat for power. The tiny old Moorish citadel that stood atop the hills looking out to the south was quite deliberately turned into a capital by just about the only Spanish king all anglicised schoolchildren have heard of, the fastidious Philip II, who married an English queen and sent an armada against another one. But of course, due to various dynastic machinations a little earlier, Felipe was also a Habsburg. My last look at Vienna 2 years ago was that great cathedral stuffed full of Habsburg memories and power statements. And this capital was thus founded by the Habsburg monarchs known here as the Austrias, already used to an imperial holy project and comfortably the most powerful kings of Europe in their day. At the new Royal Galleries, the level of craftsmanship on display is an example of how billionaires used to spend their money. They may have been ruthless, psychopathic bastards on a level that Franco could only aim at, but they also spent their money on far more creative things than our current pathetic crop of the overly rich. Though gratuitous bling was already very much a taste-deforming thing. incorporating slivers of pearl into paintings about the American conquests, or adding actual silver-lined thread onto tapestries. Today's plastic shiny Chinese glitter thread fads no doubt owe a lot to this kind of trend setting. Of course, the Austrian Habsburgs infamously married each other rather than the hoi polloi, and ended up with a uselessly inbred king called Charles and the War of the Spanish Succession. This then popped the Bourbons on the throne instead. You know, the family that made the kind of kings that we usually call Louis a little further north. I'm not going to make it to the actual royal palaces. The one here in Madrid is closed when I pass because it's being used by the actual king for some actual state function, because Spain still has these guys around, whatever their current level of paparazzi-chased incompetence and questionable lifestyle choices. The Spanish kinds didn't have one Versailles, they had 4, one for each season, though with that curious blend of Catholic piety and excessive architectural opulence that Euro emperors often aspired to. The most famous, El Escorial, was built as a monastery, where presumably monks could get away from it all with little more than a 400-bedroom palace to call home or something. Anyway, inspired by medieval cathedrals they might have been, but the Felipes were also more generally connoisseurs of the arts. This is lucky for me, because on that visit to the Prado, for free once more in the evening, which is bloody great, I realised that El Bosco is actually Hieronymus Bosch under a Spanish nickname, and his very pertinently pink Garden of Delights is on display, thanks to Felipe II, who collected it in the usual bloody fashion. In other words, after suppressing a revolt at the time when Spain ruled large chunks of the Netherlands. There is a bunch of other Baroque and medieval stuff which, as usual, boggles the mind close up. Also, this is where I get a bit more curious about Christian saints and their tales. St. Bernard was apparently not just the preacher of crusades, but was so devout to Mother Mary that we see images of her squirting milk for him from her breast, which messes somewhat with my usual picture of monkish behaviour. The big contrast, perhaps, between some of the paintings here and the tapestries in the royal galleries is that it seems easier to restore paintings to their original glorious colours. I've tended in the past to walk past the dull pastels of old tapestries, but of course they were vibrant in their day, dominating walls in a way later wallpaper could only pretend to. I like El Greco's work too. A hazy, lively quality in his portraits that breaks away from some of the stiffer stuff of his day. But then we reach all that black 19th century art, which was not so much Victorian in Spain as Elizabethan, sort of. Spain had its own Queen Elizabeth II, or Isabella II, who was much loved, completely out of touch, loved horse racing, and presided over the last crumbling years of post-imperial glory, all of which the current British might recognise, and perhaps could take comfort in the fact that a century later Spain became the pretty funky place it seems to be today. Only 100 years of stewing ahead of you then, John Bull, possibly with a little fascism en route. But I digress. As an antidote to all this, I explore lava-piés, where no feet are currently being washed, but where there are communist bookshops and my block is having a protest against gentrification and rent rises, where the local cafes are straightforward and the anchovy tapas more delicate than any I've tasted. Friends walk me past old ruins to a wonderful little garden, ancient and almost Moorish, walled off but full of flowers. On the original Plaza Mayor we bite into a famous bocadillo filled with fried calamari. That's a large Gatsby-sized roll, and I think it might be a kind of pun on boca, mouth, and cocodrilo, crocodile, but I'm just guessing. Not actually the tastiest of foods. It could have done with some butter or salt or condiments of any kind, but hey, we have landed in one of the few real tourist traps in the city, so better get filled up enough to move elsewhere. Later, in England, I come across a beer being sold called Madrid, brewed in the UK but trying to capture some of Madrid's brand, which seems a little odd. For this city's brand is spacious in reality, a little undefinable but definitely desirable. In a tapas bar called the Goat on the Roof in Spanish, a young man in a short skirt and strapless top is serving the punters. Doesn't really feel, though, like an FU sort of statement against the conservatism I'm assured exists elsewhere in Spain and even elsewhere in this city. I get more of a sense he's saying, "This is what I am today." A bit more than a rigid and provoking, "This is what I am." Just part of a cool expression of possibilities, changeable roles, and perhaps tomorrow he'll come to work in a different creation, including a moustache and a wig, or a pink toreador outfit. Spain hasn't always been good at this kind of thing, but a lot of people in Madrid seem to be having a joyful go at it. La Frontera of Moorish Spain. The jazz has just finished when we arrive at the hill fort. Drums and amps are being taken down the steep pathway on wheelbarrows. The flamenco studio is emptying again. The swallows and the martins, however, are flying everywhere, in and out of the holes in the medieval walls, my first sight of a running theme on this trip. A brief burst of human creativity has subsided and left nature to play again in the afternoon heat. I'm in Castellar de la Frontera, up the road from Jimena de la Frontera, where I'm staying, in the province of Cadiz and north of the Rock of Gibraltar, which can be seen in the distance, that infamous entrance point to the Mediterranean, and these days home to some interestingly accented Spanglish speakers flying Union Jacks. One Gibraltarian immigrant can be heard later, speaking in the apartment above Raquel's place. Most immigrants are, however, Moroccan, the same as always, a fair number of whom she teaches at the local school. She's not working this afternoon, though, and has brought me up to Castellar's citadel, whose origins hover between Moors and Christians, exchanging ground and territory over the course of centuries. This is La Frontera of the past. More recently, however, the streets of this evocative place were abandoned by locals at the end of the Franco era, and German hippies moved in instead and got up to rebellious mischief. It's subsequently been reclaimed by locals, but I can instantly see why its remote location, protected and with visibility far and wide, would appeal to those setting up a breakaway commune. Bougainvilleas in bloom line the alleys, and high above a vulture is circling, reminding me how close we are to the continent I live in, and how much vibrant life there is here in these airy hillsides. I arrived on the train from Madrid, which sped impressively through the centre of Spain and down here to Andalusia, with its rather excessive number of olive plantations, mostly for tapas offerings if my Madrid experiences are anything to go by. Raquel is not the first Spanish teacher I've spent time with. While I was staying in Madrid, I'd headed for the outskirts on a double-decker local train to visit a large and leafy Waldorf school. It was recognisable. Colourful, warm walls to match the colourful, warm heart of the teacher that showed me round, Carlos, who was embraced by a multitude of his high school students as he'd been off work for a while when we arrived. Besides the sounds of music and the impressive craftsmanship and the charming kindergarten kids, he showed me their school refectory. Tedious, overboiled boarding school dinners would be an impossibility here. Instead, there's food prepared at perfect temperatures from biodynamic organic fields, which until recently sold principally to France's burgeoning biodynamic market. But now some Spanish are getting hooked on the good stuff. Not that they've particularly been on the bad stuff, given that they have, for a variety of reasons, the longest lifespan of any major country apart from Japan. It was as inviting a space as any Steiner school I've visited, and the students were very forgiving of my somewhat stammering Spanish stories. The warmth and ease I picked up on there were a hint of what the provinces would bring me to. It's perhaps surprising it's taken the Spanish a while to get into organic food specifically, but then some of their artisan foods were already that traditionally. The best ham in Spain, for example, has nothing to do with that normal supermarket pink stuff. It's thinly sliced and buttered, deep maroon in colour, and comes from particular black-footed pigs that have grazed freely on hillsides and in oak woods and eaten special kinds of acorn and chestnuts, jamón ibérico de bellota. But these have some cousins roaming around too, who pop up as game tapas at the bar in Upper Jimena I visit later with Raquel. Wild boar, who you probably don't want to cross in the forest unless you've drunk magic potion as a baby, are proliferating in this peninsula, and on the menu here, alongside local venison. For hunting is definitely a thing in Andalusia. And often, as elsewhere in Europe, it's in the hands of the old families. Spain has a monarchy, and monarchies come with aristocracies, and landowning is as ingrained in rural history as it is in the British Isles. Certain gun owners were particularly enthusiastic supporters of the conservative regime during the dictatorship. Raquel points out that tragically it wasn't just wildlife that got hunted. In the cork forests across the valley from Castellera, fugitives fleeing the fascists were gunned down, and the stories like the hidden graves have only really been uncovered in recent years. As in the Slovenian mountain borderlands I visited 2 years ago, the scars of 20th century war and weapons have scraped across the land here. Older signs of war are down in the valley below Jimena, remnants of a munitions factory in this remote region, organised for troops fighting the British in those interminable 18th century engagements. It's easy to escape these warlike intrusions, though. In Jimena, like Castellera and the other local historic fort villages, the houses are painted white, pueblos blancos, many of them perched impressively on steep slopes, with expert construction that almost beggars belief. We stop on a walk for Raquel to chat with an elderly local or two. Figs are growing, a variety that gives 2 harvests a year for those paying enough attention to the tree. The air is fresh and the heat not yet as intense as it will be in high summer, but still it's well worth exploring over the back of the village, which descends steeply to a lovely river between sandstone slopes with vistas to make you sigh. On the way down we pass the communal land she's invested in with other local friends, a place for growing things and for family events, a clawing back of a little territory for community. Much of the land around here is given over to cork plantations, a tree which this part of Spain and Portugal is renowned for. Their bark is viscerally attractive, even from a distance, some wild forces pushing it out in unruly, spongy textures and patterns, and although seeing them denuded, stripped of their precious barky offering, is a little disconcerting, it apparently grows back in abundance. I hear stories of locals who take the cork bark on disputed territory, of landowners trying to stake their claim on traditional lands, and cork is the centre of the matter here. Similar stories involving other products and territories are no doubt familiar elsewhere at the primary end of the economy. The gift that keeps giving for some in these parts, though the world trade has been hit recently with the wine trade moving so rapidly to metal lids and even plastic ones. The walks in this region bring me the wildness I was hoping for. The river, the perfect place to cool off, diving in alongside other friends, one of whom is a local organic grocer. His twin brother is a forest firefighter, one of the crews that might get busy during this summer. Kids slide in off rocks and splash. On the far bank is a curious form of familiar immigrant, an English family. The daughter at the local school, the parents breaking away from those English-speaking coastal enclaves, seeking something else here even if their Spanish isn't yet great. Later we pick up Raquel's daughter from a sports class in the lower village. All the normal amenities for kids are happening lower down than the tight terrain of the old village these days. Bigger community get-togethers too. She says sometimes there's a big communal paella at summer festival days. That evening I hear another English immigrant passionately talking about her love for the community and trying to prevent housing developers from bringing in outsiders, which is lovely, though she's clearly also one of those who struggles with the local language herself. two older locals chat enthusiastically to each other from different tables in a rapid-fire and difficult-to-follow Andalusian accent, dropping lots of letters along the way. Raquel has to remind her daughters to speak to visitors like me in a posher, more correct Spanish dialect. But I'm also more present here to South Africa and our Mediterranean climate, geology and botany. The sandstone slopes remind me of home as well as the raw beauty, and somewhat surprisingly, the oleanders, which used to be planted in a bunch of places in Cape Town and are slowly being removed. They are, of course, very toxic, so in the Cape we're tending to replace them with friendlier local flowers. Here, though, they're in their homeland, and in profusion, their tinted petals colouring the landscape a fresh and almost provocative pink. Other colours come on a drive to territory that's a little higher and colder, where we pass chestnut trees coming into a startling blossom. Elsewhere we walk through pine plantations, sturdy types that look similar to some of those brought to the Cape, but here they're rooted, part of a broader pattern of reforestation I will hear of elsewhere too. It's a delightful place, and I'd love to spend more time here. The tempting tyranny of train tickets bought in advance spurs me on, however. Jimena also has an old Moorish castle and quite probably Roman bits before that. Phoenicians and Carthaginians came through this region too. It's been part of history for a very long time. Much of the castle is from the Christian period, after the final sweeping through in the 15th century. But there's a grand Arabic arch on the way in, and an elegant cistern inside, full of water, an aljime. Many Spanish words begin with al, and of course that's part of the influence over centuries of an Arabic-speaking culture. And respect for, understanding of and working with technologies of water is something I'm about to see a lot more of, as I continue my travels through Andalusia, or should I say Al-Andalus. First, there's some time in Ronda, where I visit the home of the Moorish king. Ronda is famous for the startlingly deep gorge that drives through the town with its turquoise river far below and three great bridges at different heights, the most recent at a vertigo-inducing altitude upon which the majority of the modern town sits. The incredible water mine in the Moorish home is an intense walk down, and initially I'm reluctant, but it's through the rock, and so it's far cooler to do that than sit in the afternoon heat outside. A water wheel brings the water way up to the gardens at the top, which are my first little taste of the Arabic rose gardens I'm looking forward to exploring. There are less savoury signs along the way, proud crosses scratched into the walls by the Christian slave labourers who had to keep the mine going, and it was they, apparently, who allowed in the unseen Christian fighters from below that finally toppled the local ruler during the Reconquista. By complete contrast, I entered a local bull ring and museum. The pitch is a circle of bright yellow sand, and the effect on walking across it is to take me straight into not just this aggressive world I've seen in many a Spanish movie, but other images, more ancient ones of Romans and lions, which definitely also took place round here. On the one hand, the notion that there's something noble in taking on a captive animal in front of an audience and dancing towards its death, however ferocious a beast it may be, is deeply weird to me, but I have to acknowledge that there's been an interest in this kind of thing across Iberia and even into southern France for millennia. I hear that generally interest in the toros is waning and rings are closing, limited these days to poorer rural people that might become bullfighters and to the wealthy that can afford to raise the bulls. However, while I remain basically opposed to this kind of thing, I've come here with an open mind to hearing more than what the Western animal rights activist in me has been willing to listen to before. That's the cultural history and importance of this business, or as bullfighting aficionados insist, this art form. Ronda, of course, is where Hemingway came to find his own stylized version of raw masculinity, and he was no fan of the fascists, so the two don't automatically align. Picasso interpreted the ring too, and at one time, back in the Art Nouveau period, it seems even the Parisians, with their newfound passion for all things quaintly Spanish, opened up to the nobility of the tradition. Ah, nobles. Here we get to the heart of things. It's those same aggressive buggers that gave us the hunt and imperialist tendencies, isn't it? Those who had a fair amount of artistic style, too, to act as a smokescreen. But of course these nobles were originally cavalry fighters, and didn't usually treat their horses kindly either. There's a whole set of stables here given over to training horses in the Spanish style, which seems to be traditionally swifter, for the very practical reason that war on the frontera of Christendom and Al-Andalus was an ongoing back-and-forth affair for centuries, not the kind of heavily armoured set pieces that Christian knights got up to between themselves further north. And these kind of mounted riders are very much part of the aristocratic version of the bullfight, and there are some ridiculously spectacular saddles on display. The people's version, though, is where the infantry version gets to have the craziest, most stylish uniforms going. Those wonderful bejewelled and embroidered matador outfits actually are obviously what appealed to the fickle Parisian smart set, and fitted perfectly with the style of the Art Nouveau that brought Carmen to the big stage. Operas are not a zillion miles from bullfights, it seems. I never really stepped into the Salamanca district of Madrid, not to be confused with the ancient university city of the same name. It's apparently more Mayfair than Oxford. But the smart set there also operate close to the most prestigious bull ring in the country. Later, passing another ring in Seville, my guide, an educated local in a flowery dress who could pass for a probable vegan in Anglo-hippie circles, engages with some visitors from Malaga. They all agree that the toros, an ancient breed of cattle, lead a carefree, free-range lifestyle that's similar to wild ungulates and a lot better than beef cattle in feedlots until their rather dramatic end. So the moral grey area seems to grow a little larger. I'm not going to be visiting the ring anytime soon myself when the show is on, however. I walk through the lower town, past the old Moorish baths, and round to a square where I stop, thirstily, for a gazpacho, that delicious and refreshing cold tomato soup I'm almost coming to seek out. There is a fabulous local guitarist playing rippling lines in the Phrygian mode. Ronda has a music academy, and Andalusia as a whole is the home to the Spanish guitar, whose cousin is of course the Arabic oud. Ronda is, however, not cheap, and full of tourists in a far denser way than Madrid was. I even cross some of those Brits-seeking alcohol types on a day trip in from the coast and avoid them, in favour of a local sweet treat and heading back to the train station for my connection. I'm enjoying the Spanish rail network, which speeds me through the olive fields and gives me a little time to breathe out before the next cultural downloads. It's not the same as actually spending time in the countryside, however, and the time I spent in Jimena was as vital as anything else on this trip. From the high points of Granada City you can see the Sierra Nevada, the grand snow-capped peaks that promise, among other things, sources of water. Early on a weekend morning, well, early by Spanish standards, I venture out with my host to explore a canyon hike with plenty of overhanging rocks to negotiate, a super-high suspension bridge, and opportunities for a cold dip. This was in the Monachil River, one of the many tributaries that end up in the Genil and appear impressively at certain points in the city. So although it's a pretty hot and dry region, the running water the Islamic rulers so loved still lies at its core. These days, however, the best way to get around is generally by land and on public transport. His car was not the fanciest. In fact, I saw plenty of European city cars with a layer of dust because of general lack of use. A great advert for the quality of the bus network, which I made plenty of use of in my days in Granada, even late at night. Though walking, which the Spanish do a lot of, was also a great activity. We walked through summer rain one afternoon, past chic new cafes and street bars. I took in my first Spanish ice cream near a lush park featuring, apparently, too many escaped American birds in its trees. Alien flora and fauna gone amok is not just a South African problem, of course. The ice cream was a delicious revelation. There were 3 different regional varieties of lemon flavours on offer in varying Arabic-sounding concoctions. Granada and Seville, which I would see soon, are renowned for bringing citrus to Europe. But it was fascinating to discover that the naranjo orange trees that fill the city are actually rather bitter. Sometimes they're called marmalade oranges, which, rather like cooking apples, is a euphemistic way of saying based with plenty of added sugar. The Moors brought them in for medicinal purposes and because they were associated with happiness. I definitely felt calmer seeing them. Though I wasn't about to add sugar myself, sweet stuff had to remain an occasional treat for now, as I'd cracked a major filling open on a local religious festival day when the dentists of Granada were all on unexpected, to me, leave. However, it was remarkably easy to get an easy and free appointment the next day, including an X-ray to check that I could manage the rest of my trip without urgently needing dental work. While being pleasantly surprised at how jacked up Spanish dentistry seemed to be, I kind of had to chuckle at the dentists pushing me to leave a review. This was perhaps the first of increasingly demanding requests for reviews I would receive from different businesses throughout this particular European excursion. The insistence began to become a background noise in my daily emails. How on earth did we manage to travel in the days before this extreme version of recommendations? And to be honest, not all the places getting 4 stars on Google were worth that, and other places I tried because I was just there were often a little more interesting. So I'd left the beauty and depth of the frontier and come to the heart of what was once medieval Moorish Spain. It's not been exclusively that for a long time, though. Granada has a lot to offer, and with the help of some natural outbreaths, some gardens, flowers, and bees, I was ready to dive in further. So, thank you for listening to this latest episode in the series, and you can find all of my articles and my recordings at lucidfringe.substack.com, except my music and poetry from the past, which is all available at simrickyarrow, all one word, .bandcamp.com, and the background recordings and sounds that you will have heard are all either from those recordings or they are my own. Please do give this a rating if it's on your podcast app. Please spread the word if you enjoy what you hear, and if you want to give me some feedback or commentary, of course I'm very open to that. Any suggestions for future episodes? Okay,